Hi, and welcome to my FlossTube channel. I'm Jane Farish, and once again, I am so glad that you're here with me. We have a couple of things to catch up on today. First of all, we have more designs that are available in local cross-stitch shops across the country. If you're looking for a printed copy rather than a PDF, I highly recommend that you get in touch with your favorite local shop and ask about it. I have just sent out an email to the shops on our email list telling them that both Lady Virginia and Hearts Come Home for Christmas are now available for them as a printed copy. So keep in mind that Lady Virginia comes with access to 9 instructional videos. So it does have good, at least I think, good instructions in the printed form, both in terms of stitch diagrams and what I call a stitch pathway diagram that shows you exactly where to start on the piece and how to progress through each stitch. But I also feel like that sometimes just seeing somebody do the actual stitching goes a long way. And during those videos, I'm also able to add some tips and make some pointers that are really hard to do in print form. So that's available. Joining her big sister, Lady Catherine. So now both of those are available both in my Etsy shop and in local shops for the chart and the accompanying stitch videos. Also, Hearts Come Home for Christmas is now available in print form. I know a lot of you have already downloaded the PDF, and some of you are waiting for the print form, which is perfectly understandable. I mean, some people like one form and some people like the other. So that's also available in local shops now. And remember, it's never too late to jump in and join that stitch along. There was no rigid start date and there's no rigid finish date. The videos are here on my YouTube channel and they are simply numbered in the order in which I suggest that you watch them so that you can watch the stitch progression. Right now there are 3 that are available, and I'm really trying to do 1 each week, trying to keep it to an hour or less. Last week, part 3, I went over quite a bit. But I felt like that I needed to include everything that I did. This coming week, we'll start adding the circular vine and flowers and leaves around the perimeter. And this is a good time to point out a couple of things. One is this one was stitched on 28 count. I take that back. Or was it 25 count? Hold on a second. Let me measure and find out. Once it's stitched, it's very easy to check the count. And keep in mind, I try to measure within a 2-inch area. I feel like that 1 inch doesn't give you quite the accuracy. So, and I'm measuring here because each one of these blocks is 3 stitches, and so it just makes it easier. So I'm going to count my blocks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 complete blocks. That's 24, 25 and a half. So that tells me this one's closer to 25 threads per inch than the 28 per inch that I mentioned a moment ago. And yes, in case you're already saying, well, wait a minute, she counted stitches, not threads, but I was stitching over 2. So when I count 25 stitches, that's actually 50 threads. So that's kind of what I was doing. So this gives me the opportunity to point out 2 things to you. One is scale. Now, the chart is the same whether you're stitching it on 25 threads to the inch, which would be translating into 12.5 stitches per inch, or 32 count like I am now. When you see the 2 of them next to each other, that's when you see the two images right next to each other, that's really when, for many novice stitchers, the point is so much easier to see. So about 12 or 13 stitches to the inch and 16 stitches to the inch. So when you say 13 or 16, doesn't sound like that much of a difference, but when you see the two of them side by side, that's really when it's easiest to understand the idea of scale. And again, you've got the same number of stitches in each of the two projects. That hasn't changed. The same chart was followed. The other thing you probably noticed is a little difference in color, and that is because the current one I'm stitching in Cosmo and the original one I stitched in DMC. And that brings me to one of the most often asked questions in cross stitch, and that is, how many threads do you use when you stitch? And I want to tell you that both of these were stitched with 2 floss strands. I didn't up my number of flosses strands in the 12 to 13 stitch per inch, the original one. So how is it that I have such good coverage with only 2 strands when I'm stitching 12 or 13 stitches to the inch? And I see so many people who insist that you have to stitch, say, with 3 strands on 14 count Aida to get good coverage. So here's the question that I want to ask, because I really don't know the answer. I can only make a supposition. What I wonder is this: the people who don't feel like they're getting good coverage on 14 stitches to the inch when they stitch with 2 strands, is that because their 2 strands are not lying parallel? Maybe they're twisted, maybe they're laying on top of each other. And so your eye isn't seeing 2 strands, it's only seeing 1. So imagine the difference between, seeing 2 strands side by side and seeing one behind the other. You just is not going to look as thick. So when you multiply that times 2, and that you have 2 strands going this way and 2 strands going this way, it can make a big difference in your piece. So I want to talk a little bit more about that today. How do you keep the 2 strands parallel, and why does it matter? There are a couple of things I do to make sure that my 2 strands are going to stay parallel throughout the time that I'm stitching. The first one is that I am going to dampen the floss strands with water. And although the primary purpose in this is to prevent knots and tangles, I feel that by straightening it out, getting all the curves and kinks out of the thread, then I stand a better chance of keeping them parallel. And certainly it's easier to see when they're parallel. So what we're trying to do is to keep these 2 threads so that they're side by side, not twisting and not laying on top of each other. So my theory is that if I start with them being parallel, and I do a couple things to keep them parallel, then I'm not going to have to do it stitch by stitch, which many people do and call it railroading. I'm not against that. I just feel like that this is an easier way. I'm going to go ahead and thread this with the 2 strands rather than thinking about the loop method. Okay, so one of the things that I do is I run the 2 strands through my needle like this, and I feel like that gets some of the twist out. So at this point, these 2 threads are clearly side by side throughout the length of the strand. So I'm going to go ahead and start this with a waist knot rather than, like I say, the loop method. So I'm going to put a knot in one end and then come away a short distance away, and I'm going to bury that strand as I'm stitching. So let's take a couple of stitches and see what happens. one of the things I'm doing here, I'm going to come in a little closer, is I'm holding these 2 strands with my thumb so that as I'm pulling the threads through, they stand a better chance of staying parallel. So I see that they're parallel here. So they're going to be parallel when they get pulled through the stitch. Now I'm stitching on, I think this is probably about a 20 count. So this is pretty large count. I wanted to use a big count so that you could see very clearly what's going on. Now you can already see where within the length of the strand, there are some places where it has already twisted up. So what I can do at this point is take my needle and again separate the 2 strands, and basically what I'm doing is I'm pushing, I'm hoping you can see this, I'm pushing the twist up toward the needle. I'm going to put my finger in here and just keep pushing this toward, and you can see all the twists. Do you see all that? Okay, so what I can do up here is I can either just untwist my needle, or if you take this end, it sort of will just twist like that. It doesn't matter to me if there's a twist on this side of the needle. It's this side that matters. So I'm, again, another thing people talk about all the time is dangling your needle and letting it untwist. And that works to a point, but it's not going to get all the twists out. It will only get the majority of them out. So let me take a couple more stitches now and see if that has improved my stitching any. And I'm going to cut this waist knot off before I go any further. So what happens when I do it in a sewing motion rather than poking and pulling? I'm still watching my strands and making sure that they stay parallel to each other. The other thing that you can do is to sort of pay attention to your stitching. Everybody rotates their needle as they're stitching. There's no way to stitch without doing that. So pay attention to that, and every once in a while you may need to just simply take your needle and rotate it the opposite way. But basically that's what I do to keep my 2 strands parallel to each other throughout the time that I'm stitching. So what does that have to do with coverage? Again, by keeping the 2 strands parallel, you're maximizing the coverage you're getting with those 2 strands. So that's one aspect of it. The other is, what is your expectation? Do you want the coverage to be so heavy that you don't see any of the ground cloth, that you don't see any of the linen or the Aida under the stitch? And if that's your objective, then you may indeed need to increase your strands. And that means you now have 3 strands that you need to keep parallel to each other, which is another challenge. So it's kind of like, if you're already not keeping your 2 strands parallel to each other, then telling yourself that you're going to do better with 3 strands is, I think, kind of unrealistic. So master keeping the 2 strands parallel first before you try adding that 3rd strand. So it just doesn't do you any good to add more strands when you're piling them on top of each other. Your eye is not going to see a thicker stitch. It's just gonna be a taller stitch. So the question of whether or not you want any ground cloth to show is purely a personal choice. Again, there is no right or wrong answer to that. In its most traditional form, I will say that it's pretty much standard that some of the ground cloth is going to show behind your stitches. And if you're doing a more primitive look, you may want to try that, because it sort of adds to the overall sort of, it sort of enhances the genre, I guess I want to say. So I guess in conclusion, the thing to know is that the number of strands that you use is a personal choice based on how heavy you want the coverage to be, and also what's going to work for that project. So the same stitcher may think it's perfectly okay to have a thinner coverage on one project because they want that more primitive look, and a heavier coverage on something else that they want to look almost like a photograph. So I hope that helps. Oh, along with that same topic, I got this question from Fran. During the process of stitching, the ends of my floss become uneven. The longer the run of stitches, the more uneven they become. And what Fran's talking about here is when you start and your two strands are perfectly the same length, and then 20 stitches later, you look at the end that's still dangling from the eye of your needle, and maybe there's a difference of an inch. I mean, it can be a lot. So she continued and she said, I wonder if that is something that is just the nature of stitching, or if there's a motion I'm making that causes the creeping thread. I love that, the creeping thread. I have asked a couple of fellow stitchers, and they also noticed this issue. I get that there's more than one side of the thread being used in each stitch over the air being stitched. Yeah, so I've thought about that too. Well, first of all, if you're not keeping your threads parallel, then you are definitely going to see a difference. But if when you're done stitching and the two pieces are exactly the same length, doesn't necessarily indicate that your threads have been parallel throughout, because you could have been making offsetting twists. I hope that makes sense. So don't use that as your litmus paper test. So what I said to her is that I used to fuss about that too, and tried to figure out what caused it, and tried to figure out what I needed to do to fix it, and I just came up empty. And so after a while, I thought, you know what? I don't care. My two threads are parallel to each other. I'm liking the way my stitches look. I'm getting the coverage that I am looking for. So it's just a mystery. I haven't figured it out yet. So let me show you the progress on Jane Hattersley. And I actually have two samples to show you today, because my daughter Elizabeth has been busy stitching the one that I'm calling the original, close as possible to an absolute reproduction of the sampler. And I'm doing the more contemporary, sort of a fresher color scheme on a lighter fabric. So first, the original. Elizabeth is stitching on pecan shortbread, which is a legacy linen. And like I say, she is using the color scheme that matches the original as close as I could manage it. And she's got quite a bit done here. She's worked the alphabet all the way over. And I love these little motifs that Jane has at the end of some of her rows. Just a simple little X here. And then this one, you need to come in really, really close, is sort of just 4 red stitches and then 4 green stitches, and it's just really, really cute. There are a couple places where Jane is a real challenge, in that her sequence sometimes changes. She starts out here doing 3 stitches across on the long run, and then suddenly changes to 2. And then there's a spot where she goes totally bonkers and doesn't pay attention at all to her count. And right now I can't seem to find it. So that's something that's more of a challenge for a stitcher. And there's this cute little thing where, and I made this mistake myself. I was busy putting this zigzag row in on my edition, and then realized that one of the stitches, actually the letter Q goes over top of it. So she does a couple things like that that makes it a challenge as a stitcher. Now here is the one that I'm working on. In fact, here's where, and I had to go back and rip out that one stitch and then secure both ends of it, and then stitch my Q, and then go back and fill in. So I did that. So I have, Elizabeth was very disciplined and got all of her alphabets done. I have quite a blank area here, but I have a lot of my motifs done, and I'm really pleased with that. And this is where I've said before, I'm doing a couple things here that are different from the original, like this crown. Jane stitched hers in the green with some of the tan with it. And I decided to do mine totally in the gray. So, yeah, so there's just a couple things like that I'm just doing a little bit differently. And up here on this crown, again, Jane fills in with a second color, and I just did the one color, and I see now I'm missing a row. And this actually happens more often than you would realize, that it's not until I photograph something or see it on a video that I'm like, oh yeah, I have a mistake there. So I'll go back and fix that. So Jane is coming along. We're both making progress, and I don't have a fixed date on when this one's going to be released. I keep thinking it's going to be, just anytime soon, and stitching takes a long time, and I don't have outside stitchers that do my stitching for me, so that kind of slows the process up a little bit. So here's a question for you, and you can answer it just in adding a comment. Here's what I'm wondering about. When a project is all cross stitch, so there's not any specialty stitches or whatever, and when the whole thing is done, in other words, it's not a mystery stitch along, is it something that you would like to do as a stitch along? If we picked a start date and said, okay, and this time, I've learned a lot from the Hearts Come Home at Christmas stitch along. I would definitely give like a 2-month window where people can get their supplies together. Do you like that idea, as far as having a start date and saying, yeah, let's all start it on the same day? Or is it better just to let you know when it's available in the shops? So that's kind of a question I've been asking myself. And 2 dates have come to mind. One is, good old January 1st, like just to say, okay, with the new year, I'm going to start this sampler. And that's pretty realistic. We might be able to manage that. Again, giving, well, if I'm going to give you 2 months notice, and that means like next week I have to announce it, doesn't it? I don't know whether that's going to work or not. But the other thing is, Jane finished hers on April 9th in 1832. So we could wait and start on April 9th. I kind of hate pushing it back that far. Or does it have to be a magical date? Is it better to say start February 1st so that it's not, overlapping too much of the holidays? I don't know. I'm throwing this out to you. Would love to have some input. Let me know what you think. A couple things have come to mind with Hearts Come Home at Christmas. That even though that one is 100% cross stitch, there's no back stitch, there's no specialty stitches, I'm still finding that there's an awful lot of material to teach, tips to share, best practices to share. And I'm getting some just really heartwarming response from quite a number of people who are telling me that it's the first time that they have successfully worked on linen. It's the first time they have even attempted it. They've been intimidated by it in the past, or maybe they tried it 20 or 30 years ago and did not have much success, and so they're trying again. And that just, as I've said to these people, it makes my heart happy to know that I am helping some people take that step when they are ready and if they want to. Again, not disparaging if you have absolute no interest in stitching on linen. And again, when I say stitching on linen, I'm talking about stitching on linen or even weave, stitching on a thread count fabric where you are going to be stitching over 2. And what that brings to mind is something I often share in my classes when I pick up that some of my students may be experiencing some frustration. It is tough when you're an adult and you have finished school, you've earned an advanced degree, you've chaired committees, you've raised kids successfully, you've managed a household, you have organized neighborhood events, you have participated in Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts or whatever, and you have done all these things successfully. And suddenly you are thrust back into a complete novice status. It's hard to be that person and say, I don't know what I'm doing, or I need help, or this is frustrating, or this is hard. So I just want to remind you, especially those of you who are raising or have raised kids, or who teach kids, or whatever, you would no more say to that child, yeah, it's hard, so just give up. And so I'm telling you, when it's hard, don't give up. It's not going to be hard forever. It's going to be hard for a couple of days or maybe even a couple of weeks. But there will come that magic hour when you suddenly realize you're not looking for the vertical thread. You're not counting every thread. Your needle is just automatically finding that over 2 rhythm. And that's a beautiful thing. And that time will come. So don't let yourself get frustrated either because you're not used to being a novice or because it's hard. Because again, you would no more say to another novice, yeah, don't bother because it's hard. So I'm telling you, you can do it. You can do it. And yeah, anyway, I hope that helps somebody. There were a lot of great comments left about stitching with variegated threads after mentioning them recently on, I guess, a couple different episodes. Which reminds me, I am working on making some sort of an index so that it's easy to find which subject matter was in each one of the videos, because frankly, I forget. So, but I got this comment from Judy, which is a great tip, and I'm going to demonstrate a little bit more about it now. She said, such great information you have shared. One thing I do when I'm separating threads and need to pick up with the same end later is to clip those ends together with a quilter's clip. It's especially helpful when there's not a lot of variegation in the thread. And that is a great tip. The sample I was using, was using very deliberately a strand that had a lot of variegation in it to make it easier to demonstrate what I was pointing out. So let me show you what Judy's talking about. So when we say quilter's clips, we're talking about these guys. So how are these useful when you are talking about variegated threads? Here is in honor of autumn. We've got this nice color scheme that's kind of reminds me of fall leaves anyway. So I'm going to pull out, like about a 16-inch length. So you can see this one starts with the yellow. It's a very little tip of, whoops, there it is, red on the end. Goes to green and red and orange and purple and back to the yellow, green, etc. So this one, by the way, is number 9008 in the Cosmo line. So just for purposes of demonstration, I'm going to cut this little piece of the red off of it, just so that it'll be easier to understand what we're talking about. The ideal thing is, when you're stitching with this length, is the first run you would do would your first stitches would be the yellow, and you would end with the purple. And then your next row, you would pick up with the purple and work to the yellow. And so that's where the clips come in handy. So you can pull out, I'm going to pull out my 2 strands. And I'm going to mark this with a yellow clip. Well, that was just a coincidence that I did the yellow with the yellow. The next time I go to stitch with this, I'm going to want to stitch from the purple end. So that's when you would want to use a different color clip. So if you put these in your sewing basket and you go to pick them up, you know that if you ended with the blue, the next one you're going to start with the blue. And you ended with the yellow. And then the next strand, you identify the same way. So again, this one's pretty clear because the colors are so distinctively different from each other. But if you have strands that are very subtle, this may be a good way to keep them straight. So I thank Judy for that tip. A couple people said that they didn't like working with variegated because they ended up with stripes. And I found a really good example one day in one of my stitching Facebook groups, that somebody had used quite a few different color variegateds in sort of a landscape. I remember it had a house and trees and whatnot. And she did an excellent job of using the variegation and putting those stripes to good use. So for example, on the roof, she worked on diagonals. So yes, it was stripy, but it was on the diagonal and it really looked like a roof. And then maybe the house, the stripes were horizontal, which made it look like clapboard siding. And then the door may have been vertical, which it was a different color, but also making the stripes go in a different direction made it even that much more of a contrast between the two. So you can use the stripiness to your benefit. You can use it to enhance the design. And that's one way of going about it. You can also, if you want to take the time, you can be very, very manipulative. And let's say if you're doing a leaf, instead of doing it in rows or columns, you kind of might start at the base of the leaf and kind of stitch it, not randomly, but filling it in as you're going toward the tip of the leaf. And you're going to get a very different look than if you did it in rows or columns or diagonal. So play with it and figure out what is going to enhance the design that you're working in. The stripiness doesn't have to be a disadvantage. You can work it to your advantage. That said, if nothing makes you like the stripiness, then I would say stay away from using overdyes and variegated thread, because you're not ever going to be happy with them. So what do you do if the design calls for variegated and you don't want to use variegated? One thing is, especially if you have the luxury, and I know especially right now, it's a luxury to be able to shop in an actual brick and mortar store. But if you can pull that skein out and then match whatever the dominant color is to a solid, that's certainly one way to do it. So I hope that helps. My family and I have very definitely, by choice, been sheltering in place. We have not kept ourselves 100% at home, but whenever we have gone out, we have worn masks, and we have been careful and chosen our times to shop, chosen our places to shop, based on what we feel like is going to protect our health for the long run. So I do have one, well, I have many very good close friends, but I have one that lives nearby, and we get together once a week and stitch or knit. Lately I've been mainly stitching and she's been mainly knitting. But we do it outside as much as we can. We sit 6 feet away from each other, and we're just very conscious about keeping each other safe. So I give that as a preface to tell you that this past week when we got together, I got all my stitching stuff out and realized I didn't have a needle, and she didn't have a tapestry needle. And then I remembered that many months ago, probably 2 years ago, I put together an emergency kit and put it in my car. And I'm using emergency kit with quotes around it because it's not your typical emergency kit. Let me show you what's in mine. I picked this up, like I said, a couple years ago in a Target store when they had a special where you got this little first aid bag, I guess I want to call it, container. If you bought, like, you know, a thing of Band-Aids and a thing of, you know, various things that would normally go into a first aid kit. If you bought 3 of those things, then you got this bag for free. I am a sucker for promotions like that. So I picked it up, and when I got home, I thought, you know what? I am going to make this my needlework emergency kit. I like it because it's zippered. And also the Band-Aid first aid thing, that if you turn it on this angle, it actually looks like a cross stitch. So inside I have tapestry needles of various sizes. I have a pair of folding scissors. I have an old film canister that's got a sponge in it. Right now that's all dried up, but easy enough to put some water on it. I have some pearl cotton, flower thread, a little thing of Post-it notes, not really sure why that's in there. And I have a chart that is still, I need to double check, but I'm pretty sure this is still on my blog. That's a free chart. That's a snowflake. And I have the variegated or overdyed floss that I used. This is a Threadworks that I used for that. And I have some linen in this part. I have a business card. Remember what I said about making sure that you have things that have your information on it, if anybody should find it. I left a little silicone packet in there. And I have linen in a couple of different counts. So my purpose in putting this together was twofold. One is in case I ever have a stitch emergency, like I did it the other day at my friend's house, that I could just go out to the car, grab my bag, and I had a tapestry needle. Oh, one of the things I need to add, I better make myself a note. I'll use this little Post-it note, is I need to add a cheap pair of readers, because that has also happened to me in the past, that I have gotten to my destination and realized I couldn't see the stitch. So as my eyesight has worsened, that's become more and more critical. But the other purpose in putting together this emergency kit is in case I'm in a time or place that somebody comes along, and again, you know, because of this whole COVID-19 thing, this scenario is less likely, but there was a time when it happened more frequently, that I might be at a ball game or someplace in the public stitching, and somebody comes by and says, oh, that looks interesting. What are you doing? Tell me about it. Or, you know, my aunt used to do it. My grandmother used to do it. My best friend does it. Whatever. Anything that sparks an interest in someone. I like to have the supplies handy that I can show them how to stitch. That I can, you know, so my supplies that are in here are not necessarily for me. The variegated thread and the little snowflake chart, the linen pieces or whatever, they're in there as a sort of quick kit, for lack of a better word, that I can pull out to show somebody new what it is that I'm doing, and give it to them if they are interested in continuing, that they can go home with enough of that floss and the chart and the linen and a needle that they can continue working on it. So that's my emergency kit. Although I do wonder at times if there's ever a true emergency and somebody looks in my car. I drive, my car doesn't have a glove box. It has like a little drawer under the passenger seat where you can keep things like your owner's manual or whatever, and that's where I keep this. But I imagine if somebody ever goes in my car truly looking for an emergency kit or a first aid kit, and they find this and open it up expecting to find traditional first aid materials, they're going to be a little surprised. Another cross-stitcher will understand, though. So these are the things that I do to keep myself safe and keep my friends and neighbors safe in these difficult times. And I hope that you are also looking for the future and doing what you need to do to stay safe and stitch happy. I'll see you next week.